Welcome back to the Foreign Field Podcast. We are here for episode 2. And again, I am joined by Wes Riddle, Steve Ray, and Kevin McCormick Jr. How's it going, folks?
Going good, man.
Yeah, it's going really good.
Fantastic.
So we got a lot to talk about today. We had NASCAR's longest race of the year, the Coca-Cola 600. Actually, the longest race in NASCAR history. When you look at the mileage, it was just over 607 miles. And a lot to talk about from that race. You got Denny Hamlin, you got Jimmie Johnson, Chase Elliott, Brad Keselowski. Just those four really we're going to dive into today. A lot more drivers we could talk about, but if we did that, we would probably be here for about a week. So let's start. Let's go back to the beginning of the race, and let's talk about Denny Hamlin and his issues. He ended up having some ballast disconnect, and it basically just sends a bunch of tungsten just flying out of his car, ends up leading him to be, not essentially parked for 8 laps getting that repaired, and essentially ending his day before it even starts. I know Denny on the radio even wanted to leave. Like, he was so just devastated that he was like, tell me when there's no point of return. I'm just getting out of the car and go home. Because at that point, what are you really racing for? You're going to go out there for 600 miles knowing you have no shot at competing. So I just want to get into this. I'll give this to Steve first. Steve, just your initial reaction to what happened to Denny Hamlin.
Yeah, it's really something that we don't see that often, and there could have been a multitude of things that led up to it. Someone just didn't tighten the bolt down all the way. We're not sure, but it's just kind of a freak thing that you don't see very often. Really disheartening for Denny Hamlin. He's been fast all year long, and I know a lot of people were picking Denny Hamlin to run up front most of the night and even have a shot to win the Coca-Cola 600. But like you said, Dom, his night was kind of over before it even began. Unfortunately, when ballast disconnects, it's a huge safety concern. We saw Eric Almirola in the 10 car hit a chunk of that ballast, and unfortunately it leads to some pretty hefty penalties, which we saw come from NASCAR too. And it was pretty tough to hear Hamlin on the radio. You could tell he was pretty discouraged. So yeah, it was pretty tough from the beginning for the 11 team.
Yeah, and with going back to the radio, all of last year, Denny Hamlin had that attitude of what's going to go right for us next. He was never down at all last year. Even after that spin at Texas, when it looked like his season was done, he still had the attitude of we're going to go to Phoenix and win. This is kind of the first time I've seen Hamlin seem down. And even after a win, again, it could just be the fact that the Coke 600 right now is the biggest race for him because that's the one race he has not won crown jewel-wise, and it's, right, in the center of racing. That's the one race he really wants to win. So I think it's nothing to worry about, in the long run. I think they're going to knock it off and just go right back on going. But to do that, they're going to be without crew chief Chris Gabehart, which is a huge loss for Denny Hamlin for 4 races. He's going to lose him, and he'll be replaced by Sam McCulley, who has 0 crew chiefing experience, but he has been with the JGR organization since 2007, and since 2016, he's been the race engineer for the 11 team, so he definitely knows what's going on with the car. Good tracks for Hamlin coming up. Bristol won last year. Martinsville, he's, one of the best in the field at Martinsville. Atlanta, he has wins there. So it's going to be interesting to see how Denny Hamlin handles these races without Chris Gabehart. Wes, how do you think this will impact Hamlin moving forward?
I think it'll be interesting. I'm not too concerned about seeing Denny Hamlin with a new crew chief, even though he's had a lot of success so far with Gabehart. I think of a good comparison is to Jimmie Johnson. We've seen a lot of improvements with him and Cliff Daniels. And Cliff Daniels, another racing engineer, didn't have really any experience in that department, but his relationship that he was able to carry over the years of working with Hendrick was able to apply to his crew chiefing skills as a new crew chiefing, one of the newer, or just taking on a new role. So I feel like with this new fellow joining Denny Hamlin there on the booth as his crew chief, I think it'll be interesting. But and of course all relationships vary, but I think his relationship, having been with Gibbs and the team for all these years, I think that's something that shouldn't be too concerning. And especially the fact, as you mentioned, the tracks that he's going to, these upcoming ones, are going to play fair in his favor. So I wouldn't be too concerned about it. And I do think that Hamlin does have a lot to look forward to. And of course, unfortunately, the circumstances didn't work out, as we saw Sunday night in the race with the ballast falling off. And that was a big safety issue. But I think it was good for him to at least run some laps because it gets him prepared for the next race that we have, which is going to be tomorrow night.
Yeah, you say he runs some laps. There were points where he'd restart at the tail end of the field and work his way up to about like the 10th to 15th area. So it'll be interesting to see what he could do on Wednesday, whether he can get through the field, obviously now starting 29th. If he could get through the field and hang up there, the competitors don't know what Denny Hamlin's really got. So that could play into his advantage somewhat, since, they don't really have any notes on what, strategy he could play, or nothing really to take from the 600 from the 11 team. And Kevin, I want your thoughts on the whole situation with Denny Hamlin.
Yeah, it was definitely a tough break for Hamlin because like how you said, that's the one race he hasn't won is the Coke 600, and definitely a freak accident really out of his control. That's always tough for the driver, especially because, that's something that you can't control. I think going forward, he'll be all right because upcoming, we got Charlotte again tomorrow night, and then you got Bristol, Atlanta, and Martinsville, probably three of his better tracks. So I think he does have the skill to kind of, to get over that adversity of not having Gabehart at the helm. And I think he definitely has the mindset as well to kind of move past those roadblocks and still salvage some points in these next upcoming events.
Yeah, it'll definitely be interesting to see what Denny Hamlin and that 11 team can do. If they could add maybe a win during this stretch, if not, try to keep up there in points, because people do forget. You got to race for points even after you have a win, because those top 10 in points going after the regular season do get extra playoff points. So points racing is still a thing even if drivers have a win. So moving on, we're going to move all the way to 2 laps to go in the Coca-Cola 600. It looks like Chase Elliott is on his way to a win. And the 24 car is in the infield in turn 2. Caution comes out. Now, Steve, I just want to give this one to you. What are you thinking when Chase Elliott makes the hard left to go pit?
I was shocked. I was really dumbfounded. And I can't really say much. I'm a couch crew chief. And so I'm never going to be as smart as Alan Gustafson or any other crew chief out there. But I think anybody could have said, why did you pit? Because we saw that clean air meant so much for those guys on Sunday night with the Cup cars, that we saw at the end of stage 3, Joey Logano hold off the field on worn tires, just because that's how much the cars depended on clean air. And with only a couple laps to go, sure, the front guys probably would have pit to try to catch Chase Elliott at a disadvantage. They were going to do the opposite of whatever he did. If he stayed out, they would have pit. And obviously we saw him pit and everyone else stay out. But I think you would have saw a couple guys towards the back try to stay out too to improve their position. So I think you would have seen a lot of buffer cars between Chase Elliott and the guys on fresh tires. And with only 2 laps to go, I think we could have definitely seen Chase Elliott hold the field off. Of course, that's not how it went down. He rebounded and ended up getting a top 5 finish. But just first thoughts, I could not believe that Alan Gustafson made that call. But then again, he's the one sitting on the box, and I'm the one sitting on the couch.
And, Wes, I want to ask you, do you think there was a restart toward the end of stage 3, I believe it was, where Chase Elliott did stay out? I think it was. I think Logano, Chase Elliott, and Kevin Harvick stayed out. And Kevin Harvick and Chase Elliott dropped like rocks. They fell to the last 2 cars on the lead lap. Do you think that had any influence on Alan Gustafson bringing Chase Elliott down pit road there?
I think it was a combination of that, but also looking at just the perspective of being the leader and knowing kind of what was going to fall next, because we all know that when it comes to being the leader, especially that late in the race, the people behind you, especially on worn tires, are probably going to do the opposite of you. So had he stayed out, the second place car, which at that time was Brad Keselowski, might have decided to pit because it could have been a last decision call, and it could have changed, it could have changed, but it would have changed the entire outcome of the race. We could have saw maybe 2 or 3 green, white checkers, or we could have saw a completely different winner. So I feel like it was a pretty tough call to make, especially that late into a run. And also with there only being 2 laps left, especially in a race that long. But as you mentioned with the tire situation, we did see that happen quite a bit. We saw Kevin Harvick. Yeah, it did work. It did not work for him. It did not work for Chase Elliott. But then again, if we look at people that did pit, we looked at Martin Truex Jr. at one point in the run. He only took 2 tires. And he said that it was even worse than not getting tires at all. So I feel like it really kind of varied time to time, depending on what the right strategy was going to be. And especially at that point in the race, had there been a couple more laps, we could have saw Chase Elliott be able to get to the lead because he had made it all the way back through to 3rd. And I believe Kyle Busch finished 5th, and he also took tires on that pit stop too. So I feel like circumstances, maybe had they been a little bit differently, or had the racing it there at the end changed just a little bit, had Jimmie Johnson been able to stay on Keselowski's door and they battled, Chase Elliott might have had a better shot to get up there and be able to take the victory coming from the back of the field. So I feel like it was definitely a tough call, but I feel like the tires there at the end, I mean, it did make a pretty big difference. As we saw, Chase Elliott was able to get through the field, same with a bunch of other drivers. So it was kind of hard on figuring out the right call, but I feel like in the end, unfortunately, though, it didn't work out for him, but it seemed and it appeared that Chase did still have a good shot of being able to get a victory that night. But Keselowski was able to get the win, and of course, a good victory for him, his first of the season.
Yeah, I feel like just being the leader is like one of the worst spots when a late race caution comes out and you've been on the tires that long. It's just it's just this helpless feeling. Chase said it. Whatever you do, they're going to do the opposite. So it's like, do you want to play offense or do you want to play defense? And you feel like you have the most control when you're playing offense because you can kind of maneuver your way through. You have the most drivability in your car. You're not trying to look out the mirror. Everything's just out the front. And we went from 11th to 3rd. I mean, one more lap, even maybe he could have gotten up there and maybe won. It's just the amount of cars that pit. If 2 more cars pit there, he might have had a shot to get back up and win. It's just the amount of people that stayed out was what killed him. And Kevin, you see Alan Gustafson, he's made some questionable calls in the past. Do you think this will hurt the confidence of Alan Gustafson in the 9 team?
I don't think so. I think Gustafson, in his, at least obviously in his mind, he thought he made the right call. And again, like how you guys have been saying, it's tough when you're in the lead, especially with a late race caution like that, because everybody behind you is going to do the opposite of what you do. And clean air did mean a lot in that race, but at the same time, like how you're saying, Dom, when you're playing defense, it's hard because you're on old tire, you're sliding around, your car's unstable, and you got guys on fresh tires trying to get around you going 3 wide. And I think taking 4 tires there wasn't the wrong move. I think that was kind of a lose-lose right there. Some could say, hey, pin your ears back and stay out there and go at it. And some could say, hey, I want the 4 fresh tires and try to make my way back up there. And they almost did. They got to P3. And again, at the end, if they had one more lap or so, you could have seen Chase Elliott maybe fight his way back through and get the dub. But I think Gustafson, will be all right. It happens. Those choices are tough to make. and I think in the long run he'll be all right. It might sit in the back of his mind, but I think overall I think he'll be all right.
Yeah, definitely. And speaking of restarts and how wild they get, I want to bring up the rule change that has been discussed by drivers. I know Denny Hamlin said it a couple of years ago, and Austin Dillon just recently brought it up after the Darlington races, is the cone rule or the choose rule, where essentially the field hits a cone or a line, and essentially each driver one by one chooses what line they want to restart in. Because at Darlington and even at Charlotte, the inside line on these restarts really has not been the preferred line. And if you get stuck, if you're second pinned on the bottom, the guy in sixth has a better shot at winning than realistically than you do. So the drivers in their eyes, why should I be penalized for being, 4 spots ahead of someone else? So, and you see all these these games on pit road with people, parking it on pit road or stopping to let someone else pass them so they get in the right line. And the cone rule would essentially eliminate that, because it would just be like, all right, the leader, he'll choose the preferred line. The guy in second will most likely choose the preferred line. Then you maybe get the guy in like fifth or sixth. They might say, you know what? We got nothing to lose. Try to gain something. Let's go to the inside and try to gain some spots. So, Wes, I want to get your take on the cone rule and if you think NASCAR should consider implementing it.
I think they should definitely consider it. I think there's always been a lot of controversy ever since we switched from the single file restarts to the double file restarts. And I feel like that happened probably in like 2009. So it's been about 11 years now. And I can recount on so many different times that we've seen somebody jump too early, somebody wheel spin that was put in the wrong position. Times where, of course, where Joey Logano won at Talladega, and of course that controversy when they hadn't crossed a finish line and it was deemed as an unofficial restart. So I feel like all these different controversies that have come up, I feel like this would be a way to at least eliminate some, because if you look at it in the full scheme of things, I don't think we're ever going to be able to eliminate all controversies from NASCAR. It's impossible. Of course, it goes back to, for example, again, Talladega, the yellow line, eliminating that or taking it away, or keeping it in place and seeing how that works, because there's always going to be controversies with different things. But I think taking into account this new rule, or not a new rule, but a potential new rule, I think it'd make for more interesting decisions for crew chiefs and the drivers. I also do think that it could eliminate some of the controversy, because in the end of things, it's the person making the decision instead of this box that's kind of there and to determine everything. Of course, a cone is, but I feel like it puts more decision into what a driver is doing and what the driver thinks, instead of leaving it just in the hands of your positioning on the racetrack. So I do think that it can make for some more interesting battles that we could see, and maybe reduce in controversy, but of course we're never going to know unless we try it. So I think it's better to take it into consideration and maybe even give it a shot just to see how it works out.
All right, Kevin, I'm going to lay out a scenario for you. I want to see, it involves loopholes, because every team is going to find loopholes with a rule. Say NASCAR implements the cone rule, and we get to Phoenix in November, and say Ryan Blaney's in the championship 4. He is in second place behind Eric Jones. Eric Jones is not in the championship 4. But say Denny Hamlin's in the championship 4, and we get a green-white checkered. Denny Hamlin is in 5th. Everyone wants the outside line, just for example. Denny Hamlin is the first car to peel off to the inside. So he's restarting side by side with Eric Jones. Say Eric Jones decides to, quote unquote, spin the tires or, miss the restart, and Denny Hamlin gets ahead and wins the championship because of it. How would that go down?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that scenario, something similar to that, because I was watching the Iceberg, the YouTuber today, and he did bring up a scenario similar to that, where a driver lets one of his teammates in, and again, that's that there's always going to be a con to another idea that you have to fix another problem. There's always going to be more problems that arise from changing a certain system. So that's something that could possibly happen. Something that the Iceberg did mention is that they could implement this rule on the tracks where being on the outside really is a penalty, like perhaps Martinsville, a track where if you're on the outside, the guy in fifth, say you're in third, or say you're in second, the guy in fifth could have a better chance of winning the race than you in second. So, if a scenario like that were to go down, personally, as a Blaney fan, that wouldn't sit well with me, knowing that, did he spin the tires? Did he not spin the tires? So it's going to be something that NASCAR is really going to have to look at and get right. But I feel like the cone rule, I feel like it's just not the right place for NASCAR. I feel like, some tracks suck when you're on the outside. But I feel like there are some things that's just the way it goes. And I feel like these restarts, that's just the way it goes. It's tough, but that's just it just happens.
See, you get all these, everything, crazy about these restarts, but no one really ever brought this up when we were having single file restarts. Steve, do you think maybe considering going back to single file restarts would be an option?
I don't think in today's NASCAR that they would consider going back to single file restarts. I think the closest that they would go is to try this choose cone rule that these drivers have been saying. But even then, like Kevin said, I think it's really a stretch for them to consider going to that. I just don't believe that single file restarts are the right thing, because we've seen at the races back when they had the single file restarts, say at like Martinsville or Bristol, if you get an early caution and there are no lap down cars, if you're at the tail end of the line, you're already half a lap down. And I think NASCAR fans as a whole like seeing the excitement of the restarts. If one lane has an advantage and the other line slips, that causes 3-4 wide racing and slipping around. And I think NASCAR fans enjoy seeing that. And as far as the choose cone rule, it works good for like your local short track Saturday night, but I just don't think that that NASCAR is really equipped for that, because down towards the end of the race, if it's at, say, like Martinsville, everyone's going to choose the inside, but you're going to get that one guy that's in 25th place that's going to try to get up to the lead.
Yeah. And
it could just create a lot more problems than I think it could solve. So I think we're going to stick with the double file restarts. I think that'd probably be the smartest move for NASCAR.
So moving back into the Coca-Cola 600, your second place unofficial finisher was Jimmie Johnson. Kevin, I'm going to go to you first. What do you think, Jimmie Johnson, he did get disqualified, failed post-race inspection. Do you think this is still a run that will build confidence for Jimmie Johnson in trying to end that 101 race winless streak?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a big boost, because he struggled for a while. Obviously, he has the drought of not getting the win, as we all know. But the fact that he's able to run well and get second, despite, he did fail post-race inspection. But at the same time, he's got to think, hey, we ran well. Like, we got second. Granted, there may have been some things out of my control that happened to the car. But at the same time, I think there's something there. And I think that might have been the spark plug for him to kind of get the ball rolling again for him and hopefully kind of finish out his career on the right note. So we'll see what happens.
And Wes, do you think Jimmie Johnson, does this impact Jimmie Johnson at all? Do you think it impacts him in any negative way? Do you think this, hurts the team morale or anything,
I think it could be a little bit of a downer for maybe the team morale, but I don't think it's going to impact anything based off Jimmie Johnson's performance, because so far this year we've seen some great speed out of him. We saw at Darlington just the other I guess not the other week, but just a few days ago, where he was, I guess last Saturday, where he was a contender for the win until he kind of put himself in a position with Chris Buescher that took himself out of the race, just an accidental mistake on his behalf there. But if you look at the scheme of things, even though this resulted in a disqualification from the race, Jimmie Johnson was running up front, He was a contender in that race. And overall, it's an impressive performance nonetheless. So I think that it's something that they're going to have to put behind them real quick, because this is Jimmie Johnson's last year. He hasn't said anything on if he plans on coming back. It's something that they shouldn't dwell on for too long, because dwelling on stuff for that long can really impact your future performance, and especially kind of lower that team morale. So it's something, if they can push it aside real quick and especially focus on this week since they have the race tomorrow night, if they are able to do that, Jimmie Johnson's going to come back and he's going to be competing in the top 5 and the top 10, just like we saw him, even though with the disqualification on Sunday.
And Steve, I'm going to ask you a pretty easy question. Does Jimmie Johnson win a race this year? How many races, and where does he win them?
I'm going to go out on a limb. I'm going to say one race, very similar to Gordon's 2015 season where he got that one win in Martinsville. I'm going to say one race. Where does he get it at? I'm going to say it's tough. We've seen speed out of the 48 car and really all the Hendrick cars all year long, so they could really win about anywhere. I'm going to put it on Kansas later in the year. A lot of speed out of the 1.5 mile tracks so far for the Hendrick camp. So I'm going to put it on Kansas. If it's not there, he's been really good at Texas in the past, especially the fall race at Texas. And that's very similar to the setup at Charlotte. So I'm going to put it on one of those 2 tracks.
And does Jimmie Johnson make a run at the championship 4?
I think he's definitely going to get into the playoffs. I think we can not lock him in yet, but I think he's definitely got a really good shot at making the playoffs. I don't quite think it'll be enough to make a run at the championship 4, but he's definitely going to get further in the playoffs. If he does get there, he's going to make a deeper run into the playoffs than in years past.
Yeah, and you get all that, no championship 4 appearance. That's why all 4 of us here at the 4 and Field podcast know that Jeff Gordon is better than Jimmie Johnson, going to end his career with more wins. Championships are bogus. Jeff Gordon won 4 real championships. Jimmie Johnson won 7 chases. So, speaking of a guy that's won a chase, Brad Keselowski, I don't want to say vintage Brad Keselowski win, but it's a Brad Keselowski win where he does not dominate. Brad Keselowski hardly dominates cup races, but he will just show up at the end and just win any way possible. And he was able to get a win with Jeremy Bowens, new crew chief for this year. And Brad Keselowski is on a contract year. He doesn't have any ride for next year. So, Wes, does this make Brad Keselowski the hottest free agent going into this year's silly season?
I think it really does, and I wonder if Penske's even keeping an eye on Keselowski to begin with, because if we look at Keselowski's performances so far this year, although he didn't really have the results in most of the races that we had seen so far, Keselowski's been leading almost every single race that we've been to. And of course, this race at Charlotte, he was able to be up front, especially in the time that he needed to, and he was able to execute perfectly there at the end and hold off one of the best to do it, Jimmie Johnson. So I think that Keselowski is definitely going to be a hot agent this year, especially seeing that, of course, he did have a Hendrick relationship back in the day that unfortunately didn't work out. But there have been talks about him potentially being the replacement for Jimmie Johnson if Jimmie Johnson still decides to retire at the end of the year. But also, I feel like Penske, you never know if they're still considering on re-signing Keselowski to the team, seeing that he has had the performances to back it up. But I feel like a lot of it's going to come down to sponsorship in the end. It'll be interesting to see where Keselowski ends up. But there is, as you mentioned, a pretty big I guess big star alongside Keselowski's name, because he right now seems to be one of the threats potentially for the championship. Of course, it's still too early to tell, but if we pick maybe 5 guys there at the top, I feel like Keselowski at this point, seeing the amount of success, especially when it comes to being up front this year in particular, that he's had, Keselowski definitely has a shot to maybe be able to pull off a championship, especially if this is his final season with Penske.
And Kevin, where do you think Brad Keselowski ends up in 2021?
Personally, I think he could be the possible replacement for Jimmie Johnson if he does decide to retire at the end of the year. And I think Keselowski, this win definitely makes him a hot topic amongst free agents for next year. And like how you said, Dom, he wasn't really up there for most of the race, but he was there when he had to be, and he got the win. And that's kind of what he does. He might not dominate the race, but he shows up when he has to, and he's able to keep himself in the race and keep himself as a threat. And he finds a way to pull out. And I think, at the end of the day, you look at stats, you're like, hey, this guy, he wins when he has to. And that's really all you can ask for from a driver is, can you win when you have to? And he does. So I think Hendrick is definitely a real possibility for him, especially with that connection he had in the past. Obviously, he didn't get there for undisclosed reasons, but he still made a career out of himself. He still made himself a force. And I think this win definitely puts him out there. So we'll see what happens, though.
So I've heard from, some NASCAR reporters that think that Keselowski and Hendrick is already a done deal. They've already talked. It's all been behind closed doors. All they need to do is sign the piece of paper. Steve, are you buying any of that, or do you think Keselowski's got a real shot at coming back to the 2-car next year?
I really do think he has a real shot at coming back to the 2-car this next year. You look at kind of the pipeline of Penske, and it's pretty much just Austin Cindric. They have nobody else behind them, behind Austin Cindric, that could really take over a ride, and that's pretty much Penske's option if Keselowski does sign with another team, is to go with Austin Cindric and move him up into the Cup Series. But Keselowski is a proven winner, wins year in and year out, and won that championship back in 2012 for Penske. I think it is going to come down to sponsorship, like Wes said. That's a big deciding factor in these discussions. But I think Keselowski really has a good shot at coming back to the 2-car next year. This year is more important than almost any other year. He has to have good performances year in and year out, and really make a good shot at that championship 4 to hopefully secure down his ride at Penske for next year.
Yeah, Penske was already making some changes. They swapped the crew chiefs throughout the team, and Brad getting Jeremy Bullins. And, for Brad, I feel like he kind of got the short end of the stick. You think of Penske crew chiefs, and it's Todd Gordon and Paul Wolfe. They are the two big dogs there. And Jeremy Bullins was added in, when Ryan Blaney came aboard. So for Jeremy Bullins to get a win with Brad Keselowski is big, because he didn't get that many wins with Ryan Blaney. But that's, again, Ryan Blaney, a young driver, still gaining experience, and he's been running up front now ever since he got Todd Gordon. So I honestly think with this win, it definitely pushes towards Brad coming back in that 2-car. I just can't see anybody else going in that 2-car. Austin Cindric might bring in sponsorship, but Austin Cindric really hasn't shown me anything in that Xfinity series that proves that he is worthy of driving the 2-car. That 2-car is a lot of responsibility. That is one of the most famous numbers in NASCAR. Rusty Wallace, Kurt Busch, Brad Keselowski, those are 3 of, NASCAR's top drivers. And you can't just step into that thing and, be, mediocre. You've got to step up and win races and championships in that car, and that's what's going to be expected from you. And speaking of the Xfinity Series, I think we can all agree the Xfinity race was 100 times better than the Cup race on Sunday. The Cup race was kind of an embarrassment. I'm going to go out and say it was an embarrassment. The lack of passing, the lack of, just any hard racing was just taken away with this package. Just, it's an insult. It's not a good look when you're the only sport on, and you're on Fox on a Sunday night in Memorial Day weekend when a lot of people are tuning in, and you provide a product like that, it's just not a good look. Definitely, gets the stereotype of people who don't watch NASCAR. All they do is go around and turn left. How hard could that be? Because it really looked like anybody could have gotten in those cars and did what happened. And Wes, I'm going to ask you, since when does a 15th place car stay out on 30, 40 lap old tires and just pull away from the field on a restart?
Yeah, it does not happen that often, and I feel like we've seen it a little bit too much, especially this year. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, I feel like Martin Truex Jr. was the prime example of that. He took 2 tires in one run and ended up losing positions to drivers that had 4 tires because the car just couldn't even handle being on 2 tires with worn tires. But yet, if you're on 4 worn tires, somehow that makes you faster than a driver that, of course, Truex was up front most of the race. In the top 5 and leading a different time, and he can't even catch on guys that didn't pit at all. So it's unfortunate to see that Xfinity. I take that back. I wouldn't say unfortunate. You would just expect more out of the Cup Series, the best drivers in NASCAR, to be at the pinnacle of their careers, driving in excellent cars and showing that they're incredible wheelmen. But here we are at a point to where, as you mentioned, it kind of looks like visually, if you're just now tuning into NASCAR, like you mentioned, that stereotype, a lot of people think, well, I could drive a car like that. They can't even pass each other. They're pretty almost all the time holding it full throttle, despite just letting off every now and then. So it gives kind of a bad vibe if you're just watching it as a new fan. Of course, we know a little bit more about it than they do, especially in terms of the package and how the cars handle and different things like that. But it is unfortunate. I was glad, though, the Xfinity Series was able to kind of back up, or not, I wouldn't say just back up, but put on a good show for the fans, especially late, despite, unfortunately, those cautions did affect a lot of drivers' performances, but it did make for an interesting finish, a fantastic one at that, and was able to provide a lot better racing than we saw in Cup.
And Kevin, if you weren't a fan of NASCAR and you watched that race, are you going to bed?
Yeah, I'm definitely taking myself to bed watching that way, because that was definitely a snooze fest. It was really it was stale. I'm just gonna say that it was really stale. There's no passing at all, no real action. You got the longest race of the year. You got 4 stages, 600 miles, and you put on a show like that. It's just not good. And like Wes said, it was good for the Xfinity Series to put on the show that they did. I know Wes didn't want to use the word back up, but they really did back up the Cup Series, because the Cup Series didn't do anything. It was really hard to watch. And granted, we did get some action there at the end, but it took caution for that to happen. We weren't seeing that the whole race. So definitely not the best for being the only sport out there. Hopefully tomorrow we can see some better racing, and hopefully in the races to come we can see something better than what we saw Sunday night.
And Steve, do you think the length of the Coke 600 has anything to do with the racing we were provided with?
Not necessarily. I know a lot of fans expressed their displeasure with how long the race was, but I think they were more upset with how the package handled. That was terrible. It was, like Kevin said, a snooze fest. I retract my statement from the first episode of the Four and Fuel podcast where I said that NASCAR is making moves in the right direction. This was a big step backwards. I could not understand why cars on 40-lap-old tires were holding guys off on fresh tires. That doesn't make any sense to me. But I think the Coca-Cola 600 just has so much history and tradition behind it that kind of, for one race, I can deal with 600 miles. I could not do more than that, especially with this package. But I say for this one race, just for the tradition of it, that it's okay. But something needs to change with this, because if it was 600 miles of the package we saw just a couple of years ago, it would have been great racing all night long.
And before we get our picks in, I just want to ask you, Wes, real quick. Do you think the racing tomorrow is going to be better because it's only just about 300 miles?
I think that it's going to make for maybe a little bit more interesting racing on the field, because we're going to have less times for people to make decisions. The runs are going to be a lot shorter, so a lot more strategy, I feel like, is going to come in. I feel like you'd think that with a 600-mile race, of course, strategy does have to play out for a long time, but when it's a short race like this, you have little time to make a mistake, and especially if you're further back in the field, because this field, the top 20 is inverted, you're going to have to make your car the best that you want it and be able to make those changes early on so you can be able to get to the front, not only just get stage points, but be there for the end. So I feel like the racing could be a little bit better in that regard, but I feel like in terms of what we just talked about with the package that we have at the moment, I don't think that it's going to make for besides maybe in the beginning with cars that were faster from Sunday night's race coming to the front. I think that once that kind of goes away and we see the drivers that do have the better cars get up to the front of the field, I don't think we're still going to see a lot of passing. But I think because of the short race being condensed, though, I feel like there will be just at certain times, especially kind of early on, with some of those drivers from 10th to 20th trying to make their way back towards the front, depending on if their cars are able to be on the same or be able to maintain that same standard that they had from Sunday night.
All right. And, this Wednesday night, we're going to see the top 20 invert, just like they did for the second Darlington race. So that will leave William Byron on the pole after he finished 21st, but Jimmie Johnson was disqualified. So that moves William Byron into the 20th official finishing position. So that will put him on pole for Wednesday night's race in Charlotte. Kevin, at least you're here. You're not freezing out. You're here to make your pick. Who will win the the Charlotte 500K?
Well, going back to Penske, they were fast. Like, they were competing Sunday night. I'm gonna have to go. I don't like this guy, but I'm gonna have to go with Logano. He did good the whole race. He was strong. He finished fifth in stage one. Then you move on to stage two. He finishes seventh. Stage three, he finishes first. He wins the stage. Obviously the race, at the end it didn't go the way he wanted to. He kind of fell back a little bit to bleed 13th. But he was looking strong for most of the race, and he was always kind of a factor. Obviously the late race caution kind of flipped things up in the air. But I feel like Logano is a pretty solid pick for tomorrow night.
Wes, who we got?
So, Kevin, you mentioned that Penske was really, really fast, and so was Hendrick. But there's still one driver in there that kind of changed up the complexion of the race that wasn't either. And it was also my pick for Sunday night. It was Martin Truex Jr. Martin Truex Jr. Was a competitor pretty much the whole race, and unfortunately the finish didn't really show in the end. But he was up there contending for most of the race inside the top five. And I feel like with that experience, especially with him still, like I mentioned the other day when we did the podcast or for the last episode, Truex, this is one of his better tracks. So I feel like if Truex can get that track position, especially starting up now a little bit ahead of some of these drivers that he had been ahead of most of the night, it might be able, if he's able to get to the front pretty quick, be able to help him pay off, especially with this race being a lot shorter. So I still have faith in Martin Truex Jr. I still think that he can get the first victory. And I feel like it's going to come at a 1.5 mile places and tracks that he's had so much success at. So I'm going to say Martin Truex Jr. again, and we'll see if that pays off.
And Steve?
Well, I think the guy riding a big wave of momentum right now, you have to look at the 9 team of Chase Elliott. Finished fourth at the first Darlington race, was running up front at the second Darlington race and got caught up in that Kyle Busch incident, and then finished officially second in the Coca-Cola 600. Won tonight's Gander RV and Outdoor Truck Series race, beating Kyle Busch. So this is a guy that's been running extremely well and in the top 5 week in, week out. I think he's going to get redemption in the Coca-Cola 600. I think he's going to redeem himself and win Wednesday night.
And I'm going to go with, someone maybe from left field. I'm going Eric Jones, that 20 car. He's getting that win at Charlotte. Eric Jones had a blazing fast car in the Coke 600. Just some pit, strategies that just did not lead into his favor. And Eric Jones is going to get a win. He's going to lock himself into the playoffs, and he's going to guarantee himself as the future of the 20 car at Joe Gibbs Racing in the Cup Series. He's going to fend off Christopher Bell from trying to take his ride, and Eric Jones will get his first win in 2020. So that's going to do it for us for our, post-race Coke 600, pre-race Coke 500K. Been joined by Steve Ray, Wes Riddle, and Kevin McCormick Jr. I'm Dom Caps. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you for our preview on Bristol for Bristol Baby. We'll see you.